the funniest joke you've been told that you still think about to this day? Story 1. A police officer pulls over a semi-truck. He gets the usual license and registration, but hears strange noises coming from the trailer, so he decides to investigate. Inside, he finds 50 penguins. "Sir, why do you have 50 penguins in your truck?" the officer asks the driver. "Well, they're my friends, and we like to go on journeys together in my truck." The man replies, "I'm sorry, sir, but you can't just own 50 penguins. I'm afraid you're going to have to take them to the zoo." The man agrees and drives off. The next day, the same cop pulls the truck over again, and once again hears strange noises in the trailer. He goes to check and finds the same 50 penguins. "I thought I told you to take these penguins to the zoo yesterday." The cop angrily tells the driver, "I did take them to the zoo. They loved it. Today we're going to the beach." Story 2. Norm told this best. A duck walks into a pub and orders a pint of beer and a ham sandwich. The bartender looks at him and says, "Hang on. You're a duck. I see your eyes are working," replies the duck. "And you can talk," exclaims the bartender. "I see your ears are working too," says the duck. "Now, if you don't mind, can I have my beer and my sandwich, please?" "Certainly, sorry about that," says the bartender as he pours the duck a pint. "It's just we don't get many ducks in this pub." "What are you doing around this way?" "I'm working on the building site across the road," explains the duck. "I'm a plasterer." The flabbergasted bartender cannot believe the duck and wants to learn more, but takes the hint when the duck pulls out a newspaper from his bag and proceeds to read it. So, the duck reads his paper, drinks his beer, eats his sandwich, bids the barman good day, and leaves. The same thing happens for 2 weeks. Then one day the circus comes to town. The ringmaster comes into the pub for a pint, and the bartender says to him, "You're with the circus, aren't you?" "Well, I know this duck that could be just brilliant in your circus." He talks, drinks beer, eats sandwiches, reads the newspaper, and everything sounds marvelous, says the ringmaster, handing over his business card. Give me a call." So the next day, when the duck comes into the pub, the bartender says, "Hey, Mr. Duck, I reckon I can line you up with a top job, paying really good money. I'm always looking for the next job." Says the duck. "Where is it?" "At the circus," says the bartender. "The circus," repeats the duck. "That's right," replies the bartender. "The circus," the duck asks again. "With the big tent." "Yeah," the bartender replies, "with all the animals who live in cages and performers who live in caravans," says the duck. "Of course," the bartender replies, "and the tent has canvas sides and a big canvas roof with a hole in the middle," persists the duck. "That's right," says the bartender. The duck shakes his head in amazement and says, "What would they want with a plasterer?" Story 3. My go-to NSFW joke. An army general is newly stationed in a desert post. On his first day, he calls for a soldier to show him around. While doing this, he notices a camel randomly tied to a tent. He asks the soldier, "Soldier, why is that camel tied to the tent?" The soldier looks awkward and answers, "Well, sir, as you know, there are no women on the base, so the camel is there for when the men get certain emerges." The general nods in understanding and says, "Well, I don't condone this behavior, but I suppose I understand." A few weeks into the post, the general starts feeling these urges himself. He calls for the soldier to bring the camel to his tent. He then goes outside, gets a stool, and has wild animal with the camel. After he's finished, he climbs confidently off of the stool and sees the soldier staring at him, wide-eyed. So the general says with a grin, "Is that how you boys do it here?" The soldier answers, still wide-eyed, "No, sir. We usually just ride the camel into the nearby town, where the women are." Story 4. A piece of string walks into a bar and orders a drink. The bartender tells him, "Sorry, we don't serve strings here. Get out." The string walks out and unravels one end of himself and ties himself up a few times and walks back in and orders a drink. The bartender says, "Aren't you the string that was just in here?" The string replies, "No, I'm afraid not. Heard this joke probably 23 years ago. Still love it and tell it to people." Story 5. A man walked into a bar, sat down, and ordered a beer. As he sipped the beer, he heard a soothing voice saying, "Nice tie." Looking around, he noticed that the bar was empty except for himself and the bartender at the end of the bar. A few sips later, the voice said, "Beautiful shirt." At this, the man called the bartender over. "Hey, I must be losing my mind," he told the bartender. "I keep hearing these voices saying nice things, and there's not a soul in here but us." "It's the peanuts," answered the bartender. "Say what?" "You heard me," said the barkeep. "It's the peanuts, they're complimentary." Story 6. I was driving down the road and saw a hitchhiker. Being in a generous mood, I decided I'd give him a ride. After I picked him up and we started on down the road, he was very thankful but said, "You aren't scared that I could be a serial killer or something?" So I chuckled, looked at him, and said, "The chances that we are both serial killers is probably pretty low, don't you think?" Story 7. George W. Bush was sitting at his desk in the Oval Office when an aide came in. "Sir, here is today's list of casualties from the coalition in Iraq. I'm sorry to say that we lost a Brazilian." Bush dropped his head into his hands. Oh no, the aide felt bad. He had never seen him so distraught. "Sir, is there anything that I can do for you?" Bush looked up and asked with pain visible in his eyes. "Yes, just tell me how many is a Brazilian. The subject probably dates me." Story 8, there's this guy, Dave, who absolutely hates going to the doctor. Luckily for him, his brother Henry is a veterinarian. So anytime Dave is sick, he tells Henry, and Henry will say, "Look, I'm not a doctor, but here is what I would do and the medicines I would take." One day, Dave breaks his leg, so he calls up his brother and tells Henry he broke his leg. Henry is quiet for a bit, and then says, "Dave, I've got bad news." Story 9, a Holocaust survivor dies and gets to heaven and tells God a Holocaust joke. God says, "That's not funny." Jewish guy says, "I'm sorry, I guess you had to be there." Story 10, an Irishman walks into a bar. He orders 2 shots, drinks them both, and then leaves. The next day, the Irishman returns, orders another 2 shots, drinks them both, and then leaves. He continues to do this for some time, when one day the bartender questions him, "How come you always order exactly 2 shots?" The Irishman replies, "Well, you see, my brother and I used to go out drinking every night, but he lives across the country now. So every night I order 2 drinks, one for myself and one for my brother." Things remain the same for a while until one day the Irishman comes in and orders only 1 shot. The bartender becomes concerned and asks him, "How come you're only ordering 1 shot? Did something happen to your brother? Is he okay?" The Irishman replies, "Of course not, my brother's fine. I just quit drinking." Story 11, a guy from the city is out driving in the country. He passes a farm and sees the farmer holding a pig up so the pig can eat apples out of an apple tree. The city slicker has never seen anything like that, so he stops, hops the fence, and approaches the farmer. "What in the world are you doing?" the city slicker asks. "Holding up my pig so he can eat apples out the tree." The farmer says, "Why not shake the tree and let your pig eat the apples off the ground?" The city slicker says, "Wouldn't that save a lot of time?" Well, the farmer says, "What's time to a pig?" Story 12, a duck walks into a pharmacy and walks up to the counter. "I'd like some chapstick." He tells the pharmacist, "How are you going to pay for that?" The pharmacist asks. The duck replies, "Just put it on my bill." Story 13, 2 muffins are sitting in an oven. One muffin turns to the other and says, "It's getting hot in here." The other muffin exclaims, "Holy, a talking muffin." Story 14, a family is visiting the zoo. Mom, dad, and their young son. As they're looking at the elephants, the boy asks his mother, "Mommy, what's that hanging off the elephant?" She replies, "That's his trunk." The little boy says, "No, no." On the other end, she replies, "That's the elephant's tail." The little boy says, "No, no. Next his leg." The mom gets flustered and says, "Oh, it's nothing. Go ask your father." The little boy asks his father the same questions, ending up frustrated and saying, "No, no, no. What's that next his leg?" The father replies, "Well, son, that's the elephant's penis." The little boy thinks for a minute and asks his father, "Well, why did mommy say it was nothing?" Father replies, "Well, son, your mom is a little spoiled rimshot." Story 15, when I was little, I would ask my mom to tell me this story joke over and over, and it would make me crack up. She said that there was a dude, and he had heard they were drafting men to a war, but he didn't want to go to war. So he pulled out all his teeth, BC, I guess, that would prevent him from getting drafted. Then when the recruiters came and made all the men line up to be inspected, the first thing they looked at was his feet. And they said, "We can't recruit you. You have flat feet." And that's it. That's the joke. Story 16, why does a chicken coop only have 2 doors? If it had 4, it'd be a chicken sedan. And why do seagulls fly over the sea? If they flew over the bay, they'd be bagels. Story 17, a grocer is restocking the vegetables when a woman taps him on the shoulder and says, "Excuse me, sir, but where do you keep the spinach?" The man replies, "Well, ma'am, we're out of spinach today, but we get some more tomorrow. So come back then." The woman nods and walks away while the grocer continues stocking the carrots. A few minutes later, the same woman taps the grocer on the shoulder and asks her, "I was wondering where I could find the spinach." Confused, the grocer says, "Well, ma'am, we are out of spinach today. However, we will have more tomorrow morning. Come back tomorrow." The woman smiles and thanks him as she walks away. Shaking his head, the grocer turns his attention back to the carrots. Moments later, the woman again taps him on the shoulder and asks, "Pardon me, but do you know where the spinach is?" The grocer looks at her angrily and says, "Let me ask you something. How do you spell dog, like in dogmatic?" The woman replies, "DOG, says the grocer. "Now how do you spell cat?" As in catatonic, CT, says the woman. "Perfect," the grocer replies. "Now how do you spell?" As in spinach. She replies, "Sure F. You dash. Wait a sec, there is no in spinach." The grocer says, "That's the point, lady." Story 18, what's the difference between a dirty transit hub and a lobster who's had plastic surgery? One's a crusty bus station, the other is a busted crustacean. Story 19, a man dies and goes to. He's met by a big, ugly demon who tells him he must choose his eternal punishment behind one of 3 doors. Behind the first door is endless fire. Everyone and everything is burning. Behind the second door is ice. Everything is frozen, people's limbs break off, etc. Behind the third door, everyone is standing up to their chests in, but they're drinking coffee and smoking cigarettes. Guys like, well, I want to burn or freeze, and they're all drinking coffee and smoking. Seems actually kind of nice, so he chooses door 3. He wades down into and sloshes his way to the coffee pot and pours his first cup. Around 5 minutes later, the demon enters the room and says, all right, everyone, break's over. Stand on your heads. Story 20. Blind man walks into a hardware store with his seeing-eye dog, picks the dog up by its tail, and starts swinging it around over his head. Manager walks up and asks, hello, sir, can I help you? Blind man replies, nah, just looking around. Story 21. I still giggle at this one. My friend told me a few months ago. Person A, did you hear about the celebrity who was stabbed? Person B, no. What was her name? Person A, Reese something. Person B, Witherspoon. Person A, no, with a knife. Or the classic, I can't believe they're still together after all that they've been through your cheeks. Story 22. NSFW, but hilarious. A penguin has his car break down and takes it in to get serviced on a hot summer's day. While he's waiting, he notices an ice cream parlor across the street. He heads over and gets a nice, big, vanilla ice cream cone and sits on the curb and eats it. Since it's so hot outside, it melts a bit and gets all over the place, especially around his beak. Just then the mechanic calls to him and says his car is ready. He heads inside. What the mechanic tells him, looks like you blew a seal. The penguin responds, oh no, it's just a little ice cream. Story 23. My grandmother hit me with the best joke I've ever heard in my life. I was about 12 when she told me this. A male potato chip and a female chip walk into a bar. The female chip goes to the bathroom. A different female chip walks up and asks the male chip, so are you Hares or Frito-Lay? Frito-Lay, man. My grandmother was an absolute queen. Story 24. A new priest at his first mass was so nervous he could hardly speak. After mass, he asked the Monsignor how he had done. The Monsignor replied, when I am worried about getting nervous on the pulpit, I put a glass of vodka next to the water glass. If I start to get nervous, I take a sip. So next Sunday, he took the Monsignor's advice. At the beginning of the sermon, he got nervous and took a drink. He proceeded to talk up a storm. Upon his return to his office after Mass, he found the following note on the door. 1. Sip the vodka. Don't gulp. 2. There are 10 commandments, not 12. 3. There are 12 disciples, not 10, for Jesus was consecrated, not constipated. 5. Jacob wagered his donkey. He did not bet his 6. We do not refer to Jesus Christ as the late J.C. 7. The Father, Son, and Holy Ghost are not referred to as Daddy, Junior, and the Spook. 8. David slew Goliath. He did not kick the out of him. 9. When David was hit by a rock and knocked off his donkey. Don't say he was stoned off his 10. We do not refer to the cross as the big T. 11. When Jesus broke the bread at the Last Supper, he said, take this and eat it, for it is my body. He did not say eat me. 12. The Virgin Mary is not called Mary with the cherry. 13. The recommended grace before a meal is not rub a dub-dub, thanks for the grub. Yeah, God. 14. Next Sunday, there will be a taffy pulling contest at St. Peter's. Not a Peter pulling contest at St. Taffy's. Story 25. So many years ago, I was shopping for groceries and standing in the aisle with the honey and syrup. An older gentleman casually walked up to me and said, what's the hardest part of licking molasses? Spreading their little cheeks. Then he walked off. Funny joke and random encounter 1010. Story 26. A woman wakes up on her birthday and says to her husband, honey, I had a dream last night that you gave me a diamond necklace for my birthday. What do you think it means? Her husband smiles and says, maybe tonight you'll find out. Later that night, the couple go out to a nice show and have dinner at their special place. At the end of the meal, the husband takes out a small gift-wrapped box, gives it to his wife, and says, happy birthday, honey. The wife opens the box, and inside is a book titled How to Interpret Your Dreams. Story 27. A man is in a bar and overhears a group of women with a strong English accent. He walks over and asks, excuse me, are you women from Scotland? One of the women angrily replies, it's Wales. The man replies, I'm sorry, are you Wales from Scotland? Story 28. Not a joke exactly. One time me and my dad and his employee were just standing outside, and it pooped on my dad's head, and his employee started to run off, and my dad's like, where are you going? And the guy says to get some toilet paper, and my dad says, why, it will fly away before you get back. Story 29. Told by Stephen Wright. I moved into a new house. I found this light switch that didn't seem to do anything. Every day I would walk by and flip the switch, nothing. I got a letter a few weeks later that said, cut it out. Story 30. Short, simple, and a dad joke, but it still makes me laugh as much now at 33 as when I was 10 or 11 and first read it. There are 2 fish in a tank. One turns to the other and says, you drive, it'll do the shooting. Story 31. A man walks into an elevator and asks the woman beside him, can I smell your vagina? No. She replies. The man sighs with relief. Oh, then it must be your feet. Story 32. A man goes to his doctor. Doc says, I have good news and bad news. The man says, give me the good news first. Okay, you 24 hours to live. The man shots back, that's horrible. What could be worse than that? I was supposed to call you yesterday. Story 33. Short and sweet. A man and a young boy are walking together, deep in a creepy forest. The young boy says, I'm scared. The man replies, I'm the one who has to walk back alone. Story 34. An old preacher, a renowned scholar, a rich businessman, and a young boy were riding on a small plane. The engine fails and the pilot tells the passengers we're going down. But we only have 4 parachutes. One of us will have to stay. But it ain't going to be me. He grabs a parachute and jumps. The scholar gets out of his seat and says, I'm too smart to die. He also grabs a parachute and jumps. Once the businessman sees this, he says, I'm too rich to die. He grabs the 3rd parachute and jumps. The preacher looks at the young boy and says, I've lived a long life, but you're still young. Take the last parachute and live. The boy responds, thank you, sir. That's very kind of you. But we can both survive. Confused, the preacher asks, what do you mean we only have 1 parachute left? To which the boy responds, before the scholar jumped, he grabbed my backpack. Story 35. I'm too tired to type out the entire thing. But my dad was a master storyteller, and he used to tell a joke about a man who lost his penis in a tragic accident, and it was replaced with an elephant trunk. The gist of the joke is that he went out to dinner with a woman, and the trunk had a mind of its own. It unzipped his fly, reached onto the table to grab a roll out of the basket, and slipped back under the table. The woman thinks she sees something out of the corner of her eye, but she isn't sure until the trunk repeats the action a 2nd time. The 3rd time it happens, she's completely sure that something strange is going on. So she asks the man what is happening. He admits to her that he's had this elephant trunk graft, assuming that she's going to get up and leave. Instead of being disgusted, she is fascinated. She asks him if he can do it again, and the punchline is, I'm sure I could, but I don't think I could take another one of those rolls up my. I'm sure you can imagine how the story can be dragged out for the setup. I have told this joke several times to people, and I can never get to the punchline because I'm absolutely crying by the time I get there. Story 36. 3 men are walking through the forest. They come upon a genie lamp. Out pops a genie. He says, I will grant each of you 3 wishes. The first man says, I want $1 million. The genie snaps his fingers, and the man is now surrounded in cash. The second man is a bit smarter and says, I want $1 billion. Genie snaps his fingers, and now the second man is even richer than the first. Now it's the third man's turn. He says, I want my right arm to rotate clockwise for the rest of my life. Now the man's right arm is furiously rotating. Second round of wishes. The first man wishes for the most beautiful wife in the world and 3 perfect children. The genie points at him, and his new family materializes into existence. The second man says to the genie, I want to be the most charismatic man in the world and be able to get any woman I want. 5 women pop up around him, and the first man's wife walks over to him as well, back to the third man. He says, I want my left arm to rotate counterclockwise for the rest of my life. Now, both of his arms are spinning in opposite directions. Last round of wishes. The first man says, I want a Fortune 500 company so I can grow my wealth and leave some behind for my children. The genie snaps his fingers, and now the man is the CEO of the most profitable company in the world. The second man wishes for perfect health and to never be sick again for the rest of his life. Now he feels like he's 21 again. For the third man's final wish, and the final wish of the group, he says, I want my head to nod up and down for the rest of my life. Now his head is moving in sync with his spinning arms. The 3 men part their ways. Years later, they decide to meet up for lunch to see how their lives have been since that day. The first man tells the group, oh, it's been perfect. I got all this money. My wife is great in bed. And I have an amazing company. The second man says, yes, your wife is great in bed. And my life has been pretty perfect too. I can get any woman I want. Am rich, am never sick. What more could I ask for? The third man pauses before he speaks. He looks at the group for a moment and says, guys, I think I up. Story 37. Mozart died a long time ago and was buried in the local cemetery. The groundskeeper was doing his job and all of a sudden heard something odd. In a panic, he ran to the Pope and yelled, Pope, Pope, come with me. There's something you have to hear. So the 2 of them run back to the cemetery and they heard Mozart's 5th symphony and they looked at each other puzzled, but they stayed listening and then they heard the 4th symphony, then the 3rd symphony, and then the 2nd played, and all of a sudden it dawned on the Pope and he looked at the groundkeeper and said, son, you do not need to worry. Mozart is just decomposing. Story 38. 3 little old ladies are sitting on a park bench. Suddenly, a pervert in nothing but a trench coat stops in front of them, opens his coat, and flashes them. 2 of the little old ladies immediately have stroke. The third one couldn't quite reach. Story 39. I was on a date last night, and they asked what superpower I would want, so I told them hindsight. They said, why would you want that? It wouldn't help anyone. I said, yeah, I can see that now. Story 40. A man walks into confession. Forgive me, Father, for I have sinned. The priest replies, what have you done, my son? The parishioner replies, I had with 7 women last night. The priest says, go home and squeeze 7 lemons in a glass and drink it. The parishioner asks, will I be forgiven? The priest says, no, but it will take that eating grin off your face. Story 41. A guy walks into the grocery store and tries to buy some dog food. The cashier says, where's your dog? We have a new store policy that says you have to show us your dog for us to sell you dog food. The guy doesn't have his dog with him, so he had to leave the store. The next day, he comes in and tries to buy some cat food. The cashier says, where's your cat? We have a new store policy that says you have to show us your cat for us to sell you cat food. The guy doesn't have his cat, so he had to leave. The next day, he comes in with a brown paper bag. He sits on the counter and tells the cashier to reach in and feel it. The cashier reaches in and says, oh, it's so soft and warm. The customer replies, yeah, I need to buy some toilet paper. Story 42. 2 little brothers are playing outside. The big brother turns to the other and says, hey, when mom calls us for dinner, we should each say a cuss word. How about it? They'll say, and you say, little brother agrees. Their mom calls them in for dinner, and they sit down at the table. From the kitchen, mom asks, what do you want to drink? Well, says the big brother, they'll take some apple juice. Shocked, she scolds him thoroughly, gives him and sends him to his room without dinner. She returns to the table, still a bit angry, and asks the younger brother, what can I get you to drink? Terrified, he responds, well, I don't want any apple juice. Story 43. I have 2. 1. How do you catch a unique duck? Unique up on him. How do you catch a tame duck? The tame way. 2. 2 cannibals are eating a clown. One says to the other, does this taste funny to you? Story 44. Not a joke, but the missus always starts crying laughing retelling it. The missus was trying to watch one of those Viking dramas on Netflix. I came home tired from work, decided to just plop down and watch whatever it was wherever it was at. Every single thing was telegraphed and easy to guess what was going to happen next. I started to complain to her how awful this show's writing was. Then I randomly said, watch next, he's going to be out in the woods off hunting deer instead of doing this. Sure enough, next scene he's out hunting a deer. I let out an exasperated what the and threw my empty water bottle at the TV. Got up and walked away. Mrs. was rolling dying laughing. To this day, randomly she'll be like, remember that time he was hunting that deer? And just starts crying laughing. Story 45. 2 women step out of the retirement home to smoke a cigarette. As they're lighting their cigarettes, it starts to rain. One of the old ladies pulls out a condom, rips the end off, slips it over her cigarette to protect it from the rain. Holy, I can't believe I've never thought of that. I need to try that, said the other lady. The next day, she goes down to the gas station, asks the clerk for a pack of condoms. What kind? He asks. I don't care what brand they are as long as they're big enough to fit a camel. Story 46. Okay, so I have a very weird sense of humor, and this is the only joke I ever remember. There are 3 men standing on top of a building in Manhattan. The first one says, you know what's amazing about New York? The way all the buildings are spaced. It means the winds are channeled between them so hard that they will actually hold you up in the air if you step off them. The second man scoffs like that's real. He says, the first man says, I swear it's true, watch, he'll prove it to you. And he throws himself off the building to the horrified gasp from the second man. But sure enough, he comes floating back up to land lightly on his feet beside the other 2. Oh my God, that's amazing, says the second man. Stand back, I'm going to try it. With that, he flings himself off the building and plummets downwards to the pavement far below. The third man looks down, shakes his head sadly, and says, geez, you're a Superman. Story 47. A rabbi journeys to the Vatican to have a spiritual debate with the Pope, but to their dismay, the Pope only speaks Italian and the rabbi only speaks Hebrew, and they've just been informed that the language interpreter they hired has food poisoning. So the Pope and the rabbi are left sitting in the room in awkward silence when the Pope decides to break the ice by making a hand gesture. And sure enough, the 2 manage to have the entire debate through just hand gestures and body language. The Pope opens by opening his arm out and gesturing to everything in the room. The final thing his arm points to is the door. The rabbi responds by pointing down to the ground. The Pope holds up 3 fingers. The rabbi responds by holding up 1 finger. The Pope pulls out a piece of bread. The rabbi responds by pulling out an apple. With that, they end the discussion and leave the room. The Pope says to the other bishops he was a very intelligent man. It was hard to argue with him. I opened by reminding that God is everywhere. But then he reminded me that God is also here. So I reminded of the Holy Trinity, but then he reminded me of the oneness of God. So I showed him a piece of holy bread to remind him of what Jesus died for. But he showed me an apple to remind me of the first sin ever committed. Every point I made, he had an excellent counterargument, and I think it was a very productive debate. Meanwhile, the rabbi goes back to his hotel and says to the other rabbis he was a complete and utter dickhead from start to finish. He started by telling me to off. So I said I'm staying right here. So he gave me to the count of 3 to get out. So I gave him to the count of 1 before I climbed over the table and punched him. Then we broke for lunch, and he never came back. Story 48, a guy goes into a clock shop and says, hey, give me a... The woman says, SIR. This is a clock shop. The guy says, oh my God, I'm so embarrassed. Could you just put 2 hands and a face on it? Story 49, mom used to work in a hospital. And when the older gents were feeling a bit glum, Shed offered to tell them a dirty joke. What's the difference between a coffin and a condom? You come in one, go in the other, but have to be stiff to get into both. Then Shed go next door, where the little old ladies always ask what the gent were laughing about. So Shed tell them the dirty joke too. The little old ladies always laugh harder in Mum's opinion. Story 50, you need a prop for this. I like to use a fist-sized rock. I had one that was perfect for this joke, as it had a natural erosion that looked like an X. ID, pick up the rock, and take it to someone, and say this in a very matter of fact, like I'm info-dumping something exciting. You see this rock, this marking, right here, point to X. This is an important artifact. It was used in Native American mating rituals. It's otherwise known as a rock. Works every time, but I lost the rock. I need a new rock. Story 51, dude goes into his doctor's office. Doctor says, I got good news and bad news. Well, give me the bad news first. You've got cancer, you're going to die in months. He's bawling his eyes out and asks, what is the good news? You see that receptionist you walk by on your way in, her. Story 52, a Brit is road tripping through rural NZ. On his travels, he spots a local farmer along the roadside who seems to be struggling with something, curious, and wanted to see if the local needed a hand. The traveler pulls his car over to the roadside and wanders over for a closer look. He finds the farmer wrestling with a stray sheep. So he taps the farmer's shoulder to get his attention. Excuse me, sir, can I ask, are you shearing that sheep? The farmer glanced over his shoulder, irritated and very sweaty. Nah, bro, not sharing this one, get your own. Story 53, 3 ducks get arrested. Now in the courtroom. The judge says step forward, one at a time, and state your name and your crime. First duck steps forward and says my name is Duck, and my crime is blowing bubbles in the pond. Judge says $50, get out of here. Second duck steps forward and says my name is Duck Duck, and my crime is blowing bubbles in the pond. Judge says $50, get out of here. Third duck steps forward and says my name is Bubbles. Story 54, a older guy I used to work with who was approaching retirement just had the quickest wit. 2 FM engineers are in the office changing one of those 2M long fluorescent light tubes. Without skipping a beat, the older guy says, how many engineers does it take to change a light bulb? It was the perfect mixture of the classic joke and his delivery. That was 5 years ago, but I still have a chuckle about it. Story 55, so you sit next to someone and say, how do you ask a deaf farmer how much his chickens cost? The other person thinks for a minute, then says, I don't know. Then you lean in a little and yell, how much do your chickens cost? Note, best told while fairly drunk sitting around a campfire. Story 56, 2 old people in rocking chairs at the Sleepy Willows retirement home. Dolores look over at Dave and says, Dave rocks back and forth and replies this goes on for a while until Dolores says, so when does this oral start to feel good? Told to me by my mother-in-law. Jesus and St. Peter are playing golf. St. Peter steps up to the tee and makes a clean drive right down the middle of the fairway. The ball lands on the green a few feet from the hole. Jesus steps up and swings. He slices it deep into the woods. The ball ricochets off a tree and lands on a lily pad in the water hazard. A frog jumps out of the water onto the lily pad and swallows the ball. A hawk swoops down from the sky and grabs the frog. When the hawk flies over the green, the frog croaks and spits out the ball. It falls neatly into the cup, a hole-in-one. St. Peter, exasperated, turns to Jesus and says, we're going to play golf, or you want around all day? Story 57, Mickey Mouse finishes his side of the story to the judge. The judge sits there and says, sorry, Mickey, I can't grant you a divorce from Minnie because you think she is crazy. Mickey, I didn't say she was crazy. I said she is goofy. Story 58, a woman walks into a doctor's office, complaining of bowel issues. When the doctor takes her into his office, he asks what the issue is. Well, I am quite gassy all the time, but my farts are always silent and never smell. In fact, I have farted about 15 times just in your office, and you haven't even noticed. The doctor thinks for a moment and then prescribes her some pills. Take these for a week, and everything should be fine. If you have any more issues, please come back. A week later, the lady returns. The doctor asks how her treatment is going, and she replies, I'm not sure what you've given me, doc. My farts are still silent, but they smell horrific now. The doctor looks to her and says, well, now that your sinuses have cleared up, we can work on your hearing.